questions in the Q&A section.
And I'm delighted to be here at the Berkeley Public Library right before Valentine's Day. Some of you who go back a long way in the Bay Area may remember me as the founder of the Coca-Cola chocolate dessert shops in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some of you may be readers of my 10 cookbooks, and others of you may have come to my classes. Okay, so let's get started. Today I'm going to do a very simple, embarrassingly simple cookie called chocolate wedding cake cookies. They're inspired by the traditional Mexican wedding cakes, only I have substituted all of the nuts in the Mexican wedding cake for chocolate. In this case, we're going to start out with 2 cups of chocolate chips. My favorite brand, local company, Guitar Chocolate, 2 cups of it. When we talk together, I'm sure you're going to want to know all the different other kinds of chocolates that can be substituted in here, but the easiest thing is a bag of chocolate chips. That's 11 or 12 ounces, and it's 2 cups. And on top of that, just 3 tablespoons of sugar and a little bit of salt, half a teaspoon of salt. 2 cups of flour goes in there. And then the whole point, and this goes into the food processor, and the whole point here is to process until the chocolate is in tiny little bits. And when you go in there and feel with your fingers, it'll be like feeling chocolate gravel. The flour will be stained chocolate, and the pieces of chocolate will vary from coarse sand to maybe the size of lentils. So let's get going. This takes maybe about a minute, and you'll have to check it a couple of times. I'm going to stop now, even though I know it's not ready. Can we look in here, I wonder, just to see how not ready it is? The flour is not yet stained chocolate, and the chocolate pieces are way too big. Most of them are still the size of chocolate chips. So I'm going to go a little longer. Let's do one more test here. I'm reaching in. The flour is now kind of tan, almost chocolatey. Honestly, this is not a precise task here, so a little more, a little less is still going to turn out to be a good cookie. So let me just... Okay. We're going to call that done. And the last thing to go in is the 2 sticks of butter. I know that when we get to talking, one thing I didn't mention to you is if you wanted to vary this cookie a little bit, you could grate in the zest of a lemon, of an orange, for example. You could add some spices. We can talk more about the ways to vary this and make it your own. But otherwise, the 2 sticks of butter in chunks, something between squishy and firm is the right texture for this butter. But again, there's no precision to this recipe, so you kind of can't mess it up. Okay, so the butter goes in, and then the last ingredient is a couple teaspoons of vanilla extract. Meanwhile, of course, we've preheated the oven to 325 with a rack in the lower third and the upper third, because this recipe will make 2 sheets. If you're baking one at a time, you'll just put a sheet in the center of the oven. Okay, there we go. So now we're going to process until the butter and the flour and all of these ingredients come together, and it'll make a dough that you will recognize. And we'll stop and have a look at this a couple of times. It takes longer or shorter depending on how squishy or firm your butter was. You just wait until it all happens. So we're just going to check and see that it's not yet pulled together as a dough, but you can see that it's starting, so let's just continue. Okay, so it's just about there. I'm going to give it a couple little more seconds, and then whatever loose flour, we'll just push that together with the spatula. Okay, so we just want to make sure that any loose flour is mixed in there, and the easiest way to do that is often just to take out the blade and transfer the dough into a bowl, and then either with your fingers or the spatula make sure any of the dry flour that's not mixed in gets mixed in. See, there's always dry flour at the bottom here, not worried about that. We're going to just mix it in. Okay, so moving it into the bowl just gives me a chance to mix in any stray flour. You can get in there with your hands if you want, or with the spatula. Fine, just to make a cohesive, even dough. And you can see that there's flecks of chocolate in here. Now, I know that you're all going to want to ask me what other kinds of chocolate we can use, and what if you use something that's sweeter or less sweet, and we can talk about that after the demo. Okay, so once we have a cohesive dough, a cookie scoop or a tablespoon or what have you, we just want little sort of tablespoon size or 18-gram little lumps. And I've learned over the years that this bakes off better if they're round. So after I scoop, I kind of go back. I am a fuss budget. I go back and actually make them rounder. They come out with a nicer shape. So just to show you the scoop. And this recipe will make 24 cookies if you keep to my size, and that's 2 trays. So now I want to go back in here and start rounding. You maybe want to see some of the rounding up. Okay, so when these are all rounded up, they're about 2 inches apart. I'm going to stick them into preheated 325-degree oven, and it's going to be, 18 to 20 minutes. And they come out of the oven, they're a little bit crackled on top, they're not too soft anymore. And when they're warm or when they're cool, at your leisure, you can sprinkle a lot or a little powdered sugar on them. Just makes the presentation nice. And because the cookies are not that sweet themselves, the extra sugar doesn't hurt a thing. One of the things that we can talk about, I'm sure you're going to ask me, is what about gluten-free? What other kinds of chocolate can I use in this recipe? What about vegan? What about recipe variations? And I hope we can have a discussion about that. What I love about these cookies is they're crazy, crazy easy, but the finished cookie is actually a little bit elegant and kind of an adult chocolate experience in that they're not too sweet. They're very, very chocolatey. And you can even vary that. Once you've made them once or twice, you can increase or decrease sugar. Over the years, I've done this so many different ways with so many different chocolates, and this is it.
All right, welcome back.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah.
That was great.
Yeah,
Well,
that was great.
all that good editing. It was fun to First time I've seen. I did make one I misspoke once. Recipe makes 48, not 24.
All right.
Okay.
And just to let everyone know, I did send the recipe along. It's in an email, automated emails that went to everyone who signed up via Zoom and through Eventbrite. So thank you, Alice. That was awesome. And people are so excited to be here with you today. So Dan and I had created some questions to get us started, but I think we have plenty of questions from the audience that I think we can just jump right in. So what we'll do is I will keep an eye on chat to see if there's any questions, but I'm going to encourage everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A. I believe you'll probably see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and Dan and I will just take turns reading them out to you, Alice, okay? So I'll kick us off with the first one. Maxine says, I have such fond memories of your liquid amber truffles. Any idea where I could find the recipe?
There is, I don't have a recipe that's suitable for, I'd have to, there isn't one. Let's just put it that way. There kind of isn't one. Interestingly enough, a lot of people have been asking me about these recently, which I don't know what that is, some kind of old memory, but those were, I can tell you this, you can go out and buy yourself some hollow chocolate shells and make a batch of really liquidy caramel sauce. Fill the shells, plug the hole in the shells, and roll the shells in melted chocolate, and then roll it in nuts, and there you have it.
Awesome.
Brooks wants to know, do you recommend convection bake or bake for pastry?
I do not have a convection oven in my home, so all recipes tested here are in a still oven, no fan. So that doesn't mean you can't do it with air on. It's just that you follow the usual instructions, which is to lower the temperature and look for doneness a little early.
All right. Diane asked, can you use other flour, like finely ground almond flour for the cookies?
Well, interesting, instead of wheat. I think this is a gluten-free question. I have not done this. I do believe they will fall apart if you use finely ground almond flour for all of the flour. I did, after we videoed that last week, I did run home and try the cookies with 2 different gluten-free flour blends, commercial blends. And they did kind of work. The blend that held the shape the most was the blend that had a little xanthan gum in it. The other one worked too, but my observation, since most of the gluten-free flours are rice-based, is that the chocolate flavor was way more intense than with wheat flour. So my suggestion, if you use a gluten-free flour blend that's based on rice flour, with or without xanthan gum, is that you decrease the amount of chocolate maybe by even 3 or 4 ounces. Because I have found that rice flour amplifies other flavors in a really big way, and you can use that to your advantage sometimes. But in this case, with so much chocolate, I think you need to reduce a little chocolate.
Nanu says that they loved chocolat and all of your cookbooks. And their question is, what would you change in the recipe if you wanted to do chocolate chips and nuts? And Keith is also asking, if you wanted to add nuts, what kind would you add?
Well, the original recipe that this is inspired by is a phenomenal recipe. And, I mentioned it I guess I mentioned it in the video. Mexican wedding cakes are made with, I think it's about the same recipe, with 1.5 cups of nuts ground up in there instead of the 2 cups of chocolate. So you could go back to that recipe and maybe stick some chocolate chips in there. However, I will tell you from my own experience, when I first had this idea to replace the nuts with chocolate, I then thought, well, what about both? And in fact, I love the one all with nuts, and I love the one all with chocolate. I didn't love the one that had chocolate and nuts as much, but that's just me. So just go for it.
Great. Mary asks, I am curious about your preference for, I don't know if I'm saying this right, guitar chocolate chips. I usually use Ghirardelli. Once I tried guitar and found them a bit waxy.
That's not been my experience. I like the flavor a lot. We all have a different, palate for these things. So I say go with what you love.
Alice, Greg wants to know, do you have a suggestion regarding how to prepare this recipe if we don't have a food processor?
Oh dear.
And Rosemary asked if she can substitute a mixer.
Well, a mixer's not going to cut up the chocolate chips, right? So I thought to myself, and I did not test this, but just general knowledge, lots of times people who don't have a food processor might have an old blender, and in which case I would say toss those chocolate chips into the blender with a handful of the flour and flick it on and off until you get that sort of, fine, gritty, texture that I described. Then dump it all out of the blender and turn on a mixer and mix in the butter, soft butter, and all of that. In other words, you just need something to get those chocolate chips, broken down into teeny little bits.
And it looks like several of you are asking about food processors. And I can tell you that pretty soon, the Tool Lending Library will be lending kitchen tools. And we do have both full-size Cuisinart food processors, as well as the smaller food prep food processors and KitchenAid mixers as well.
Excellent.
Great. So Natalie asked, the cookies look really yummy. Do you have any recommendations for a small processor? I want to get one, but have very limited space in my apartment kitchen, both counter space and storage.
Yeah, that is a thing. Being the cook that I am, I have a lot of counter space, and I'm that person for whom the processor lives on the counter, so it's nothing for me to just open it up and use it. I know that people don't always have that. I think that if you're talking about a couple or a small family, you don't have to get the biggest processor in the world. Even I don't have the biggest processor in the world, and I cook for families sometimes, but that's still, that still takes a little bit of space. I've been a Cuisinart person all these years, but that doesn't mean that I have tested all of the other ones. So I may not be the right person to make this recommendation.
When I was purchasing a lot of the kitchen tools for the Tool Lending Library, I did read a lot of reviews to help choose models, and the Cuisinart Mini Prep Plus was highly regarded. So that's the one that we purchased for the library. And Charlene wants to know, should they use salted or unsalted butter?
Oh, great question. Pastry chefs in general are always going to tell you to use unsalted butter. That's because we are control freaks. And because, for one thing, we like to control the amount of butter that goes into any recipe. And different brands of butter have different amounts of salt in their salted butter, which means that that amount of salt is going to fluctuate. And we would rather start out with 0 salt in the butter and then salt the recipe to get it the way we want. That's one answer. The other answer is a lot of recipes are so rich in butter that the amount of salt in the butter would be just too much for the recipe. So 2 answers, all leading to, unless the recipe calls for salted butter. Sometimes when we make caramel or toffee, we might use a salted butter. Unless the recipe calls for salted butter, unsalted butter is the thing to do.
And then just an announcement, I will follow up after this event. I'll send an email to everyone who registered for this event via Zoom and Eventbrite with the recipe. All right, so Maxine asks, could you add Grand Marnier or triple sec?
Well, I haven't done it. You can try it. Often in a recipe that has liquid, which this does not, you can adding a little more liquid or trading in a liquid will work fine. I've not made this recipe with any liquid, but would it hurt? No, use it instead of the vanilla. perhaps, and then add a little bit more of it, I say go for it. Maybe you start, good idea. Because there's no eggs in this, and there's nothing that you can't eat at least a little bit of raw, exchange the 2 teaspoons of vanilla for 2 teaspoons of Grand Marnier or whatever you want to do, and then taste the dough. Taste the dough and see if you can taste. You might want to add another teaspoon or 2, depending on what you taste, but there's no reason. And that's the other advice I give about sweetening in this. For some people, this might be a little not sweet enough, or too sweet, depending on the chocolate chips you use. You can taste the taste the dough and make an adjustment that way. You can do that with the liquor too. Good question, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
I think I'll try that.
All right, we have another equipment question. In baking recipes, when is a food processor appropriate for mixing as compared to using a stand mixer?
Oh, it's such a different action. A stand mixer, even with whether it's a paddle or a whisk, is all about whipping air into the mixture and building a little bit of volume. A food processor is more about pulverizing things or mixing things together without putting air in there. That being said, there are some things that could go in either place. And if it weren't for the fact that we had to break down these particles of chocolate, this is the kind of dough that could be mixed in a stand mixer with a paddle attachment, if that's the kind of mixer you had, or in the food processor. This is an interesting question too. I hadn't thought about it this way. There are things that can go either way. But anytime you're trying to whip air into something, like making a cake where you're counting on that air, or making a meringue, or making whipped cream, well, whipped cream is even an exception. See, it's always more complex than we think. But if it's a cake and you're trying to whip air into it, stick with the stand mixer. Stick with the stand mixer. Very good question. I think I could go on for about a half an hour on all the examples of all the ifs, ands, and buts.
Yeah. Great. Okay, Joanne asks, what is your favorite type of chocolate chips to use? Semi-sweet or bittersweet?
I've already said that I like these guitar chips the best. I think they make the best chocolate chips. Chocolate chips are usually not the highest quality of all the chocolate made by a company. And knowing that, I also know that the guitar chips are very good quality and have a lot of good flavors, but they even have several different ones. They have semi-sweet, they have bittersweet, they have extra bittersweet. I tend to like the semi-sweet and the ones called a coma, only because I like the taste. I think the sweetness is appropriate for a chocolate chip. I also don't always make these cookies with chocolate chips. Sometimes I use bar chocolate, 70% or something that's more bittersweet, and I adjust sugar upward or the amount of chocolate downward. And I think there's some notes at the bottom of this recipe that will give you that idea. And again, what I will choose for what recipe depends on the recipe quite a bit. I don't know if that was a good answer to the question.
What is a coma?
A coma is one of their, it's A-K-O-M-A. It's one of the, I think it means heart in some African language, and it's just a name they put on one of the chocolate chip varieties that they have.
All right. So Wendy asked about, can you use nuts in this recipe? I think we covered that one earlier, that yes, you can, but she also used to work at the Cocolat store on Shattuck many years ago. So hello, Wendy. And a few people, including Mary, are asking, can you freeze these cookies?
Yep. No reason why not. You could freeze the dough before baking them. You could freeze them afterwards. They also last for a couple weeks in a sealed container after you make them. It basically has this sort of shortbread-like texture. So yeah, no reason why not.
Great.
I have some of the leftovers from our shoot the other day as dough in the freezer right now.
Yeah, I just had a cookie that I froze from your demo this morning. So yes, they're delicious, even frozen. So Lorraine asks, thank you for providing weight measures. And she asks, why do American bakers still resist using weights over volume?
I don't know. I don't know. Some of us have been nagging about this for 20 or 25 or 30 years. But I think people are coming around. I always put weights, and a few years ago, quite a number of years ago, I realized that if we're going to go with weights, grams are even easier than ounces because they're smaller. It's a smaller increment, and when you make little adjustments, and anybody who cooks makes adjustments and often writes down on the page or in the cookbook what adjustments they made, it's much easier to write small adjustments as 10 grams or 12 grams or whatever than some weirdo fraction of an ounce. I don't know why American cooks are this way. I don't. I hope that we will all be changing. My advice to young cooks, especially if you want to be a baker, is to get with a scale right away, learn to use it. It takes less time to learn to use a scale than it takes to learn to use any digital equipment that you have. And a decent scale costs less than 10 lattes. You have no excuse.
All right, we have a couple of questions from people interested in substitutions. So can you substitute almond or peppermint for the vanilla extract?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
I think peppermint might be very cool, very delicious. Almond also. I've also done this recipe, as I said, with a grated zest of an orange in that bowl and a little bit of, I think I've done all kinds of spices in there. I've done, I have notes here on all the different ways I've done this over years. I've put cardamom, I've put cinnamon, I've put, handfuls of different baking spices in there with the orange. Other substitution questions? Yeah, let's have them.
See if there were any others. Is it okay to cut down on the amount of sugar?
Yeah.
All right.
My notes at the top of the page of notes says, chocolate chips, 12-ounce bag with 3 tablespoons of sugar, but my earliest notes say even 2 tablespoons of sugar is okay, is good.
And someone asked if you have advice for making the recipe vegan.
I haven't done it, but I'm almost 100% sure that if you substituted, I would use a really good brand of refined coconut oil, unless you want the flavor of coconuts from unrefined oil, but that should work fine. Or if you like the vegan butters, I'm not hugely fond of them myself, but if that's already something that you like, no reason that a vegan butter that's meant for baking wouldn't work here.
And how do you test for the doneness of baked products?
Depends on the baking product. A good recipe is going to give you some sort of cue, visual cue, not just time, but a visual cue. Like this recipe says something about a little bit of cracking and slightly firm when you press with your finger. A cake recipe will give you maybe a toothpick or how it feels when you tap on it, kind of thing. And then you get used to that. You get that's part of the learning process for baking.
Lorraine says that their favorite cookbook of yours was Chewy, Gooey, Crispy, Crunchy. And do you have another cookbook coming out soon?
I don't have something coming out soon because I've been doing way other different things lately. But my most recent book is Flavor Flowers, and the paperback edition, which was gluten-free flavor flowers. So if anybody is more interested in gluten-free whole grain baking, those would be good choices. Also, interestingly, most of my books have won either IACP or James Beard awards. The interesting thing to me is that the one book that never got an award is the one that the most chefs tell me they appreciate the most. And that one was called Simple Dessert. Oh God, what is it called? Pure Dessert. Pure Dessert. Really, really simple ingredient-driven recipes. So you guys have a lot in stock at the Berkeley Library, right?
Yes.
Yes. We have many of your books. I almost want to say, I think we have like 10 different titles
Cool.
of yours. Yeah. All right. Ellen asks, how about melting the chocolate rather than using a food processor?
Oh, such a good question. The reason that I don't melt the chocolate is because then the texture of the cookie will change dramatically and not in a good way. The whole idea of having these tiny, even though some of the particles are very, very small, it retains the shortbread texture of the cookie, which is very, very nice. Once you melt that amount of chocolate and combine it with that butter and flour, you're going to get a very dense cookie. Even though the flavor might be nice, our perception of delicious is driven often as much by texture as flavor. So I'm going to say I don't think that's going to work out so well.
Someone else asked, what is your favorite frosting for chocolate layer cakes?
I like a whipped ganache, a really light whipped ganache. It's in some of my books. It's about, let's see. It's about, depending on the chocolate you use, depending on the chocolate, it's going to be 7 or 8 ounces of dark chocolate over which you pour 2 cups of cream. And you stir it until all that chocolate is melted, and then you refrigerate it until it's firm and cold, and then you whip it. And it looks really light in color. It's not very sweet. It's a lovely, lovely chocolatey, creamy chocolate flavor and texture next to a chocolate cake. It's in several of my books, and if you saw, let's see, I have a video course on craftsy.com.
Oh, great.
Sandra wants to know how long you baked the cookies.
How long I baked them? Somewhere between 18 and 20, which is pretty much what the rest says.
Yeah, and just a friendly reminder, I did include the recipe in the RSVP emails that everyone received once they signed up for this event. So you'll see the recipe in the lower portion of your email, but I'll also send that email along again after this event to everyone via Zoom and Eventbrite. So details like how long to bake the cookie will be included in that.
Also, I added to the end of that recipe some of the variation ideas, using different levels of chocolate and varying the sugar and so forth.
Great, and I don't know if this was already asked, what kind of guittard chips do you use? Milk, semi-sweet?
One of the dark ones. I like the Acoma. I like the semi-sweet. I haven't tested these with milk or white chocolate yet. I'm a little bit curious. If I did test that, I would get rid of I would take out all of the sugar from the recipe because those chocolates are very, very sweet. But I have no idea what the heat in the oven and that amount of chocolate for milk and white would do. It's interesting. I might try it. Somebody should try it. Let me know.
Christine wants to know, how would you make them minty? Would you add crushed mint on top or mint extract to the dough, or add crushed mint directly to the dough? And she loves the idea of the orange zest and wants to know any other additions you might recommend.
All kinds of baking spices can go in there with the orange zest. Let's talk about this mint. Maybe some mint oil or extract in the dough. Another way to do it might be to leave the chocolatey dough as it is, and maybe, how would we get that sugar to be really minty? Ooh, roll it afterwards in crushed peppermint sticks, or crushed peppermint sticks lumped up in the mixer with some powdered sugar, for example. Good ideas. Good ideas.
Lorraine asks, what's your favorite butter brand that's commercially available at a regular store?
I use regular store, even sometimes store brand, believe it or not, fussy as I am about so many other things. Unsalted butter for most things that I'm going to be doing with chocolate, because chocolate is such an overwhelming flavor. I think that this question is probably leading to, do I like French butter or European butter? And I do. I love them, especially on my bread. I often, unless I'm making a croissant or laminated dough where you want as little moisture as possible, I don't splurge on those butters in baking. Um, because I think that most of our recipes were designed for butter that has a little bit more moisture in it, and that can affect things. If you substitute in European style, very dry butter without a lot of moisture in it for a cookie recipe, sometimes the cookie will spread too much because the cookie recipe was developed with a different butter. And unless you use less of that European butter and sometimes add a little bit of water to make up for it, you're not going to get the same result. So I personally save the great delicious butters for making croissant or putting on my bread. And I use a regular, decent quality national brand of butter, unsalted, for baking.
Diane asked, does the texture of the cookie change using a chopped bar versus chips?
You mean a pulverized bar versus chips? Only very, very little, because a bar of chocolate, will spread a teeny bit more. That doesn't mean I wouldn't use it, because some of those bar flavors, it's even better chocolate than chocolate chips. So I do it. It'll be a small difference in texture, and maybe not so much in texture as in the spread, how the cookie spreads.
And Sheila says that they've always loved your recipes. And do you ever get tired of chocolate? Your tricolor mousse cake is the best chocolate dessert ever.
Oh, tricolor mousse. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yes. I think that was voted dessert of the year by Harvey Steinem in the 1980s or something. 1983, 1987. I forgot. Do I get tired of it? No, I don't get tired of it. There might be a moment when, okay, I've had enough, but I go back to chocolate. In the old days when I was working in the cocoa a lot, I would come home and it would be all over me. But then I wouldn't feel like eating it. But then after a shower and a little rest, I'd be ready for more. Yeah, still true.
Awesome. Kirsten asks, what is your favorite cookie recipe or the one you make the most?
Oh dear. After doing this for about 50 years, that's a big ask. I love this particular cookie. I've been making it ever since I sort of thought of it. I've been making it a lot and using it a lot. When it comes to gooey cookies, which this is not, I think I like the chocolate decadence cookies that you might find in the Chewy Gooey book and in the Bittersweet book. Those are like crazy decadent, amazing. I love the traditional Mexican wedding cake that doesn't have chocolate in it, the one with the nuts. I like Linzer cookies. I like the spices and the little window of jam. I like thumbprint cookies. Gosh, I could go on. I like homemade graham crackers. So I veer wildly from very decadent and gooey to, just crunchy and satisfying. I like Tweels, those tiny little thin cookies. I like a lot of cookies. Wrote a whole book.
Here's a nice comment from Christine. I loved Au Cocolet for years and even had a boss who gave me a monthly allowance at your store.
Oh my God.
So, I think the boss was trying to get some cookies. Yeah, and somebody else said, what was your motivation or inspiration to become the chocolate queen?
Oh. I had this marvelous opportunity to go and live in France for a year when I was just married in the early 70s, and it changed. And I was always an eater, it's obvious, I suppose, and always a chocolate lover. But I tasted desserts and chocolates at a whole new level. just being there, cooking there, wandering around in the street, you know, buying pastry, tasting chocolate truffles. It was our landlady who was, we thought she was really, really old. She was 2 years older than I am now at the time. And she made chocolate truffles for us at for our birthday and at Christmas time. And they changed my idea of what chocolate could be. And when I came home, the idea was to make, I decided to go to grad school and maybe make these chocolate truffles and sell them around town. And it was a perfect time in Berkeley to be selling something like that around town. Some of you, I'm sure there are some old Berkeley timers here who remember the Pig by the Tail and the early days of Chez Panisse. Pig by the Tail was across the street. So I sold truffles at the Pig by the Tail and at some of the new, what we used to call gourmet and cheese shops back then. And it just became a growing idea to bring a more European sensibility about chocolate and desserts and confections.
Great. Keith asks, do you think any small amount of coffee flavor could be added?
Sure. You could even maybe try a little actual ground coffee beans. I mean, I buy my coffee in beans, so whenever I want to add coffee, I sometimes and I have a recipe in one of the books that actually has fresh ground coffee, not instant. You know, you could try that, or you could dissolve a little really good instant espresso in some water instead of the vanilla, and work that in there. Experiment. It can't go too wrong.
There's a couple of questions about the effects of freezing the dough. You know, would it change like the flavor at all? And do people have to wait a little bit longer before putting the sugar on the cookies? Does it change the texture at all?
Does it? No, I mean, freezing the dough, I just for ease sake, I would scoop them into their little balls and then freeze them. And then you'd want to defrost before you bake, right? You don't want to put them in the, I don't think you want to put them in the oven frozen, I guess. And the sugar goes on after the baking, so I'm not sure I understand that question. Although if you I know, I understand the question now. Freeze before dusting them with sugar. Yeah, maybe so. Sure. But let's say you've already made some and you've dusted them with sugar and you've served them and nobody ate them at your party and you wanted to freeze the leftover. Go ahead and freeze them with the sugar on, and when you defrost them, if the sugar has seeped in or gotten a little damp, just sugar them again.
Great, and there also are a couple questions about using brown sugar versus white sugar.
Oh, yeah. I've done that. I did that version of these cookies for the Peruvian Chocolate Consortium a couple of years ago, and I put some spices in there, and I put some Peruvian peppers in there, and I used what do you call that? Raw sugar. I think I used a little white sugar and a little raw sugar, panela, or you know, Mexican raw sugar, and it was delicious. In other words, you can have at this recipe and play around with it in a million ways. And remember, you can taste the dough. So if you're putting sugar in or different things, you can give a little taste to the dough to see whether the level is good. Brown sugar.
A few people are asking about storage. What's the best way to store the cookies?
Airtight container, cookie tin, room temperature.
Charlene asks, do you use parchment paper for this recipe and all your baking recipes?
I use parchment for this. I remember after we shot this that I forgot to mention it. You may have seen it on the sheet. I definitely do it for this. I am that fussy cookbook person who tests things with and without. So I don't have a go-to always do it rule about parchment. I use parchment under some cookies and not under others, because parchment, believe it or not, is a tiny bit of an insulator, tiny bit. It prevents the bottoms of things from getting overly brown too fast. So with a chocolate cookie, I like the cookie to get fully baked, a really chocolatey cookie. I like the cookie to get fully baked and I don't want to scorch the bottom. So I use parchment for this. However, when I bake something like a chocolate chip cookie, where I like the flavor of that sort of caramelized toasty flavor and browning, I bake it on a bare pan to get that. And to me, it tastes better and has a better texture than on a piece of parchment. That being said, having run a bakery for many years, we baked everything on parchment because it's easier. You can't go pulling cookies one at a time off of 100 pans, right? So it's always on parchment. So parchment can be used under any cookie. It's just that for home baking, I'm pretty precise about what I use it for and what I don't. And those of you who check out or buy the Chewy Gooey Crispy Crunchy book, which is all about cookies, will notice that each recipe gives you my first and second choice of pan preparation. And I drove my editor crazy because every recipe was different.
Wendy addresses you as her baking hero, and she asks, what is your favorite chocolate dessert? And she means the most chocolatey.
Oh, the most chocolatey?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, the cookies I mentioned, the chocolate decadence cookies are super chocolatey. They're also sweet. Another super chocolatey recipe that I love that is not so sweet is the chocolate souffles that probably appear in my book, Bittersweet, with the cocoa bean cream. I could just go on, so it's kind of unfair. The triple chocolate mousse that someone mentioned, which does appear in one book, is chocolate, dark chocolate, milk chocolate, and white chocolate on the top. That's a wonderful, wonderful chocolatey thing. I'm speechless.
I want to read a few of the comments and compliments. You deserve them. Lynn says, you're the diva of baking. All your recipes have been thoroughly tested, and they haven't had a recipe of yours that didn't work. And I think you have the most fantastic books, and they're well used. Let's see. Stephanie says, in 1976, she was pregnant and used to walk the Cocoa for a treat, and what a great treat it was. She can still remember the taste of those truffles 45 years later. It's amazing. And are there other baking authors that you recommend, books that you would recommend to beginning bakers, perhaps?
I have hundreds of cookbooks, and I gave this a teeny bit of thought before, and I thought, well, how do I sort this? And I thought, well, I could start with people who I think are classic, people who were Bay Area people, local people, people who were my friends, and that led me to think about the late Carol Field. I learned about bread from her first bread book called The Italian Baker. It's still a very good book. There have been so many bread books, good ones, since then, we all know. But I think that she inadvertently started the craft bread movement in a way. She was the person who inspired Il Fornaio to do a whole chain of restaurants with bread. Anyway, Carol Field, I love her. She is gone these many, many years. The late Flo Breaker, very precise, well-tested. Any of her books. Sweet Miniatures was the first book, and then there were a couple of other titles. I'm sure that the library has them or should have them. That's Flo Breaker. David Lebowitz, everybody knows and loves, I think. Follow him on his blog, and he's in Paris. But he has so much integrity about testing and so many good details, and he's such a fun read and such a lovely friend, and deserves all the good things that come his way. Are we just going to talk about baking? Not necessarily, right? We don't have to talk about baking. There's so many. I mean, there's a zillion baking. Rose Levy Berenbaum, of course, is marvelous. I started learning about food and cooking by reading The Joy of Cooking in Bed and in the Bathtub. And I still, even though gone through many, many iterations. I sort of grabbed, when I went to college, I grabbed my mom's 1963 book and took it away. I don't think I even asked her. And then for the 1997 Joy, I was asked to work on several of those chapters, and we are now 2 editions past the 97. It's a giant book. I think it's still a great all-purpose start for anybody. These days, I use Paul Johnson's Fish Forever. You guys shop at the Monterey Fish Market, which I do here in Berkeley. Paul Johnson's Fish Forever, fantastic. If you're still eating meat. Bruce Edel's books on meat. Trust him, like him very much. Deborah Madison on anything vegetables, vegetarian, or even part-time vegetarian. She's thorough and wonderful, has a beautiful palette. Used to be local, no longer. I could go on and on and on. Joyce Goldstein is a treasure, a Bay Area treasure.
Well, we have about 5 more minutes, and we do have some more questions. You've answered so many, Alice. I think you've answered almost 60 questions. Thank you so much. Just a couple more questions. Maxine asked, do you know of any recipes you like that use creme de marrons?
Oh, creme de marron, chestnut cream. Oh boy, I love chestnut cream. I feel like I had a whole phase, a whole chestnut phase. Do I have a recipe with creme de marron? There's a classic French thing. You know, I discovered it in a French cafe where I ordered the Mont Blanc dessert, which was literally a bunch of creme de marron scooped out of the can into a little parfait glass with a creme fraiche on top, and that was delicious right out of the can. Gosh, I think you have to Google that. Nothing is coming to mind. I feel like I've done some stuff over the years with creme de marron, but I cannot at this moment remember what. One of the coco la bouches had creme de marron on the cake, maybe before the filling. We flavored buttercream with creme de marron. We made chestnut buttercream. And I think that in my book, Flavor Flowers, my most recent book, I think there is a gluten-free version of the bouche with the creme de marron buttercream.
Donna has an interesting question. Have you noticed a change in baking and availability of baking products since you first began baking in Berkeley?
But we have so much more of everything. I mean, flours is a whole other discussion. So many different kinds of flour. And I think in some ways the definition of, I think, gosh, this is a big topic. We should do an hour on this. We have so many more baking ingredients. That is wonderful. And it's such a better quality. Chocolate has gone through incredible changes in the last 20 years with the craft chocolate movement. So chocolate is at a much higher quality level than ever before. And there's so much more diversity there. We have all kinds of raw sugars, flavorful sugars. We have all sorts of whole grains. We have all sorts of gluten-free. We have better butter, all kinds of butter. It's like the world is our oyster. I'm almost speechless at the question. It's hugely. It's quite wonderful.
Anne asks, what's the best scale that you would recommend?
My scale is I don't know. I think they're all fine. My scale is sort of my scale is probably a postage scale from some commercial company. Now, I've been using it for years and years and years and years. But if you go off to Sur La Table or wherever you buy, you can find something under $40, probably under $30. That's perfectly fine. And look at some ratings on Amazon, whatever. I haven't bought one in years. So maybe Dan, have you looked at ratings on inexpensive scales?
I didn't look at scales, no. But the library does have access to consumer reports, so.
Yeah, this is not a rocket science. You don't have to overthink it. Buy something from a trusted source where you can see some ratings and some comments. It doesn't need to have a lot of bells and whistles. all of them should have the button called the tear, which zeroes out, so you can put a bowl on there, press the tear button, and it goes to 0, so that you can then put stuff, weigh stuff in whatever vessel you put on top. I think switch between grams and ounces is a good thing, because some recipes that go by that call for ingredients by weight will say ounces and others grams. So you want that, but I think most of them do that. So yeah.
All right. Do you have a favorite non-chocolate dessert?
Oh, favorite non-chocolate dessert. Catching me off guard. I make a very beautiful olive oil pound cake. It has many variations. It has a chocolate variation too, but an olive oil pound cake with sherry in it and olive oil that I like a lot. Olive oil is kind of a thing for me lately. I have an olive oil sponge cake that I love a lot. Running out of steam, but a lot. I like a lot of things that are not chocolate. I promise, I really do. And some of the things that twills, all kinds of twills, those little delicate, little tiny thin cookies. I love them. Some things that are delicious. Oh, I love creme brulee and anything related to it. Flan, all of those things. And some of those things I've noticed are, you think, oh, I love this. Wouldn't it be better with chocolate? And that's sometimes the answer is no. Something is so good just because the butter and the eggs and the cream and all of that deliciousness. Chocolate just gets in the way.
Before we wrap up, I just want to let you know a few people have been baking along with us today. Yelena made some cookies earlier, and she's been enjoying them during the chat here. She says that they're sandy and yummy, and she's having them with warm milk.
Good.
And Kathy says, guess what my husband's getting for Valentine's Day? Yummy, thank you.
For a minute, I thought it was going to be a food processor, but cookies.
Awesome. Well, I will send another follow-up email with the recipe today to everybody. Again, thank you to the Friends and the Foundation of Berkeley Public Library for helping make this event possible. Alice, thank you so much for spending your time this afternoon with us and getting together with us earlier to film that demo. It's been wonderful working with you. We have lots of Alice's books in the Berkeley Public Library's collection. You can go to our website, berkeleypubliclibrary.org, to reserve your books and pick them up at Outdoor Services, or you can give us a call if you need help with that. Thanks, Dan, for being a great co-host. And thank you, Andrea, for making the video as well. We'll make this video and the recording with all your questions available eventually on our YouTube channel. So thank you again, and happy Valentine's Day to everybody.
Thank you both, and thanks to the Berkeley Public Library. It's great. I wish I could have seen everybody, but I'm glad you were here.
Well, you've answered so many questions, and we've had over 160 attendees today. So it's the highest attending event we've had so far for our Farm to Shelf. So
let's do it again.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
everybody.
Alice.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.